So I'm going to talk about democracy, institutions, and growth. I don't think I need to repeat it, but I will. There are huge differences in income per capita or other measures of prosperity across the world. So if you look at this map, countries that are in dark green are above 50,000 per capita income in terms of purchasing power parity. Those in red are between 1,000 and 2,000. Those in dark brownish red are less than 1,000. So more than 50-fold differences. These are huge and hugely consequential. But actually, you can see their consequences in a range of things, not just economic outcomes. So if you look at infant mortality, for example, the variation is even more than 50-fold. So some of the places, many in sub-Saharan Africa, but a few in Asia and Latin America, have infant mortality rates in the hundreds, whereas infant mortality, especially in Northern Europe, is now less than 1 or 2 per thousand. They are also associated with something that people care greatly about, and we sometimes ignore in economics, which is security of life. So when you actually look at why is it that people are pouring into Europe and leaving Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq, it's not just poverty. Poverty does play a role, but the real reason is violence and threat of violence. Even when violence isn't there, it's the threat of violence that's so consequentially important in people's lives, and that's what they're trying to flee. And that is in turn also correlated with various measures of government efficiency. Now, all of these measures are subjective. One of the nice things about GDP per capita, infant mortality, and violence is we sort of know what they mean. There are some measurement problems, but we sort of know what they mean. These are measures that have been recently sort of compiled. They measure different aspects of how the government functions. So the impartiality is essentially sort of captures things like the rule of law. Is it corruption, favoritism? Are the politically powerful people getting fair trials when they need to be brought into justice, and so on and so forth? And there are huge differences. Incidentally, this is not one-to-one correlated with GDP per capita. There are some places where GDP is somewhat high, like China or Russia. I mean, not very high, but medium to high, where this impartiality index is extremely low, the red, dark red places. But those are all important things to understand, and so is this one, which actually perhaps is even more interesting from some of the aspects that I want to touch upon briefly as we go along. It's professionalism. How efficient and effective is the government and its bureaucracy? And again, you see a huge difference. Now, some of the places in Latin America and actually East Europe are very low in terms of their professionalism, and so is Russia. So that sort of measures the capacity of the state to be able to sort of pursue its aims, whatever they are. Now, the question is, how do we understand this range of correlations across a number of things that we care about? Certainly prosperity, health, violence or control of violence, and professionalism and impartiality, because it's so important for the range of services that we obtain, and of course it's potentially causally related to things like infant mortality, security of life, and perhaps even threat of violence or the control of violence. So there are many ways of thinking about these factors, and all of those have been emphasized over time. Geographic differences have been put forward as determinants of income per capita differences. Certainly, there are very notable patterns if you look at this picture here. The red and dark red places are those that are near the tropics or in the semi-tropical areas. If you look at this picture on infant mortality, same. So perhaps there are some geographic determinants that are very heavily important in understanding both the prosperity and a range of health-related outcomes that countries suffer. And various different mechanisms have been suggested. Or culture. You know, one of the reasons why people argue governments don't function in some areas is a general culture of favoritism, patrimonialism, and those things are also often argued to be economically important for things like prosperity, innovation, economic growth, productivity, and so on. And once again, you know, you can pick places as you look at these different maps and try to single out cultural characteristics. One notable thing in all of these maps is that there is a lot of concentration. So perhaps the reason why, you know, violence and threat of violence is highest here in Central America and the countries around it, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and so on, is a cultural factor, or perhaps the geographic factor. What I'm going to argue is that in thinking about all of these things, what's much more important than cultural and geographic factors are societal choices. We have made choices, some currently, some historically, that shape the way that our society functions. And I'm going to put those broadly under the name, under the title of institutions. But I'll distinguish and tell you much more about what I mean by institutions. And I will try to argue two major things in this talk. One is that these institutional ensembles have huge effects on all of the things that you care about. I'm going to show you, of course, just a few of the correlations and attempts to the causal relationships, but you know, the same is true for other outcomes like the ones I've shown you, or even the ones that I haven't shown you that are also important for people's welfare. And second, and also crucially, that these institutions are neither exogenously given by some sort of accident of geography or culture, nor are they purely historically determined, though history does play a role. And I'm going to try to build the case both theoretically, so conceptually, of course I'm not going to show models or anything like that, but conceptually why this is a good way of thinking about the world, and also I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of evidence that this is indeed the case. In doing this, I am drawing upon you know, a lot of work that I have done. Bas was very nice to list some of the papers. I didn't know which ones were my most highly cited papers, and I could see that I'm actually drawing on several of them. But a lot of this was actually not just summarized, but further developed in the book that I wrote with James Robinson, Why Nations Fail, where we tried to sort of unify and present an institutional theory of economic development and show that this theory has a lot of legs in terms of explaining the sort of variation that I'm showing today, although we did not focus on some of the health and government quality type issues, and I'll come back to that a little bit. The basic thesis of Why Nations Fail was actually quite simple. It's maintained that economic institutions which guide the nature of economic relations, formal and informal rules that are important for economic transactions, are the major determinant of economic outcomes. And at the two polar extremes, we have sort of summarized those as extractive and inclusive economic institutions. Inclusive economic institutions are those that essentially quite closely resemble what you see in your first economics course. So when you first go into an economics auditorium and hear a couple of lectures on economics, you are presented a world in which there are very secure property rights. People are free to choose whatever they want to do. Monopoly is rather rare, and people can transact a lot of things, including shares, including contracts. And there is in the background both a legal system that enforces the contracts or these property rights, and another sort of set of institutional arrangements that provides a relatively equal footing for people in taking part in those arrangements. So in the economics courses, we don't talk of a world in which, only 50% of the population has access to education, only 50% of the population has access to infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Those are the hallmarks of what we call inclusive economic institutions. But, and here is where we sort of depart a little bit from the first economics course, is that we think that most societies throughout history and even today are not ruled by these inclusive economic institutions, but something that looks much closer to the other polar extreme, other ideal type, which we call extractive economic institutions. I'm just going to get some water. And by extractive economic institutions, we mean, roughly speaking, the opposite of what I sort of refer to as inclusive economic institutions. Insecure property rights, monopoly everywhere, supported by rights given to some firms or entry barriers of some sort or another. A judicial system that does not treat everybody as equal, and most importantly perhaps, a decidedly tilted playing field where some people have access to some professions, some people have access to some opportunities and others don't. And crucially, these extractive economic institutions, we argued, and this is where the conceptual structure begins, have not arisen by mistake or by some accident, but they have been designed, at least in part, because they may not be the best one for economic growth, but they look after the interests of some people. Let me start giving an example, which will also act as a segue to the next thing that I want to emphasize. Take one of the societies which was actually one of the richest in the 18th century, 17th century and 18th century, Barbados. At the end of the 17th century, Barbados had a very nice and detailed census, so that enables us to know exactly what was going on in Barbados. So the first thing you know, even without the census, is that Barbados was a plantation colony. And in fact, from the census, we find out that 80% of the population of Barbados were chattel slaves. These slaves worked at or below subsistence wages. In fact, they worked so hard that many of them died before the age of 30. And most of the land which the slaves worked on actually belonged to a small subset of families in the island, on the island. Perhaps 100 families that owned the biggest plantations. We also know that at the time, Barbados, in terms of per capita GDP, per capita production, was one of the richest places in the world because sugar was so valuable that despite this very, very, very poor part of the island, the 80% that lived at subsistence, the amount of wealth that was being generated was huge. So that is a quintessential example of extractive economic institutions. Slavery, where not only you don't have access to a level playing field to take part in different activities, but even on your labor, you don't have property rights. You're not allowed to own anything. You're not even allowed to acquire human capital if your owners don't want to. So how was this quintessential extractive economic institution supported? Well, it was supported not because the slaves were happy. In fact, one of the classic problems of any slave society, which was very important in Barbados too, are slave revolts. The conditions are so bad that slaves revolt quite periodically. Well, it was supported by a particular set of political institutions. First, the army was very important because it was necessary to repress people, put them to work, coerce them to work. Who controlled the army? it turns out that a very small group of people control the army. The top commanders of the army generally came from that 100 or so families that were the main beneficiaries of the slavery system. Well, it had its own law. The law was very important in saying that actually the slaves did not have the rights, they could not run away, they could not ask this thing, etc. Well, who controlled the law? Well, the top judges on the island were also from these 100 families. And the top politicians of the island also came from these 100 families. So what you're getting here is a political system that monopolizes political power in the same way that extractive economic institutions monopolize economic benefits and economic opportunities. And that sort of political concentration of power we're going to call extractive political institutions. And the other end, on the other end of the scale, we have inclusive political institutions, which are those which distribute political power equally and also introduce constraints on how that political power is exercised. And that second part is also quite important because any political system is going to involve delegation of political power actions to politicians, bureaucrats, whoever. And it's very important as part of this inclusive political system that once that delegation has happened, those people don't become de facto dictators. Now, the other aspect of inclusive economic political institutions that we emphasized is that they actually require some degree of political centralization. So you cannot just have inclusive political institutions, which are the ones that are necessary for supporting inclusive economic institutions, by having a voice for everybody, but without any structure of centralized authority. For instance, Somalia, after the fall of Siad Barre, went back to its tribal structure. It's a very equal sort of system where there's no clear hierarchy. Tribal leaders make decisions, but tribal leaders are not so much above other people. But it was a chaotic situation. Why? Because the lack of political centralization meant that any sort of political, social, or economic decision immediately sort of degenerated into some sort of conflict. So the reason why I'm emphasizing this here is because much of what I'm going to talk about is this aspect, is that lack of broad distribution of political power and participation. But this is very important, and in fact, this is the topic of the book that James Robinson and I are working on right now, how this political centralization takes place and how state capacity gets built, but I'm not going to talk about that much more today. The important thing here I want to emphasize is there is this synergistic relationship between political and economic institutions. Economic institutions that are inclusive are more likely to be supported by politically inclusive institutions, and likewise for the extractive one. It doesn't mean that you cannot have somewhat inclusive economic institutions and under politically extractive institutions that centralize political power, for example, in China. Not that I want to claim that China has inclusive economic institutions, but it has certainly moved much more in that inclusive economic institutions direction over the last 35 years. But its political system has remained broadly extractive, with political power in the hands of an unchecked group of political Communist Party officials and Communist Party structure and the army. So that is not ruled out by the theory, but that this is unstable. Ultimately, there are going to be forces that either put you in this direction or this direction. And in fact, there's a lot of clampdown going on in China, which I think reflects the difficulty of staying with that off-diagonal box. So the main thesis of Why Nations Fail, which I want to sort of talk a little bit more about in the next half an hour, is that growth is much more likely under inclusive economic institutions, and therefore under inclusive political institutions, because inclusive economic institutions are much more likely to be supported by inclusive political institutions. This is not to say that growth is impossible under extractive institutions, because we discussed the possibility of extractive growth, but extractive growth, we argue, is different in nature. It's not based on productivity improvements, technological change, and it's less sustainable in the long run. It also has other implications in terms of inequality, social welfare, and so on than inclusive economic growth. One important idea I want to put on the table, and this is sort of part of the conceptual structure, is that, you might think even kleptocrats, even, the worst dictator that controls power in a politically extractive institutional system would have incentives to increase the size of the pie and increase and fuel economic growth as much as he or she could. And if that perspective was right, institutional explanations wouldn't go very far. And the reason we argue and document empirically and historically in other settings is that oftentimes economic growth, especially inclusive economic growth, doesn't benefit the elites, the politically powerful people in the politically extractive institutions. And that is for two reasons, and both of these reasons together and individually prevent an extractive system both from reforming itself into an inclusive one and from pursuing growth-enhancing policies and reorganizations and reforms under the auspices of its extractive institutional structures. One is what we call economic losers. Economic growth is often going to benefit not the firms, not the sectors, not the families associated with those who hold power. So for instance, if economic growth comes by getting rid of some monopoly privileges, it's not going to benefit the monopolist. And it is often the monopolist who is associated with the extractive economic regime, extractive political regime, and that's the essence of this argument here. But second, and even more importantly, is the political losers. Economic institutions and economic arrangements that fuel productivity growth, innovation, technological improvements, reallocation of resources towards their more efficient uses are very much in the spirit of Schumpeter's creative destruction. They bring the new, they take away the old. But they do the same not only in the economic sphere, but they do the same in the political sphere. They erode the political power basis of those who benefit from politically extractive institutions. And that means that people under politically extractive regimes are afraid of allowing the economy to change too much. So in other words, if you go back to the example of China today, it is impossible for the Chinese system to totally reform the economic relations because it would start undermining the very existence of the political monopoly that it has. Now, but my sort of claims were not just about the conceptual structure, they were about arguing that these explanations that I have theoretically sort of summarized and are the outcome of the work that James and I and other people have done, and we summarize in Why Nations Fail, actually has a lot of explanatory power. I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to try to document that using three different approaches. The first one is just a case study. And it's a very simple case study because it looks at a society that was unusually homogeneous in terms of ethnicity, in terms of economic structure, in terms of linguistics. And then it got divided into two, not by choice, but by a geopolitical deal. And then we could see the two halves with two different sets of institutions evolve over time. And that's North Korea, which got divided into the South and North Koreas at the end of World War II, the South under the tutelage of the United States, and the North under the control of the former communist guerrilla fighter Kim Il-sung. And essentially, this is exogenous because people did not really choose very much whether they wanted to go one ideology versus another ideology. And although the South, especially in the first 2 decades, is not very close to what we mean by inclusive institutions, it was much more inclusive than the North. And then over time, these inclusive institutions even became stronger, and the South, throughout it had a economic system that was based on private property, something not too far from rule of law. It made land reforms and big educational reforms in the 1950s that helped create an equal playing field. And then in the late 1980s, it also democratized. And we don't have great data on North Korea because it's a secretive dictatorship. But what we see is that using the estimates from Madison, so another reference to the important Dutch economic historian, we see that, in fact, in 1950, they were probably at exactly the same level of income per capita. That sort of stays, so doesn't much change in the first 2 decades, especially that's during that time. North Korea is getting a lot of aid from the Soviet Union. And then you see that North Korea essentially remains the same. In fact, later on, it sort of declines. This is the period then when the regime gets into big crisis, and South Korea is growing very rapidly, as everybody knows. So in about 50 years' time, there is a more than tenfold difference between South and North Korea. So this is a very simple example, and it has the nice feature that it's an actually, we don't have to talk about the origins of these institutions. To a first approximation, they are imposed. Of course, then they have their dynamics, but it's fine. So we're going to talk about the origins of these institutions in a little bit. But it sort of gives us a sense that a fairly large change in institutions, even within a short period of time, 50 years in the human history is not a very long period of time, can have drastic consequences. Now, there are 2 problems with this example, if I wanted to use this as main exhibit in showing that these institutional differences matter. One is that it's comparing just 2 countries, so that's not a great comparison. You want to do, if I was going to try to show you that a drug was effective and I had a control group consisting of 1 patient and a treatment group consisting of 1 patient, that wouldn't be particularly serious. The second is that the institutional difference we have here is really huge. North Korea was really a dysfunctional sort of Juche regime of the very extreme communist sort. So is it true more generally? Well, if you look at more generally and look at the correlation between various measures of institutions that are not so extreme, you see the same thing. Institutional variation correlated with the level of per capita income, as well as the other things that I've mentioned. But here, the endogeneity that I already emphasized comes back to bother us. We know, and I have emphasized, a central part of our theory, of my conceptual framework, that these institutions are endogenous. They don't just arrive like the ones in North Korea versus South Korea, and they're not just given by some historical accident 500 years ago in general, although there might be some influences from those historical events. So we really have to come to grips with the fact that the institutional variation we see around the world has been to some degree chosen, has been to some degree been subject to pressures from the bottom, from the top, and we have to deal with that. So therefore, in trying to deal with the long-term consequences of institutions, we really should start with a theory of at least one part of the institutional variation. And so I'm going to talk about that, focusing on long-term changes first. And the sort of the theory and the setting that I'm going to focus on is that of the European influence on institutions around the world during the colonial period. Starting at the end of the 15th century, Europeans, of course, as you know, discovered the New World and rounded the Cape of Good Hope. And many of the European powers, including the Dutch, became colonial masters in very different parts of the world. Now, there is very little doubt in historical research that this was a very profitable enterprise, at least early on. And the Europeans were quite ruthless in affecting, shaping, imposing institutions around the world. Again, the Dutch case is a case in point, but it's not so different from the French, British, or the Spanish one in specific settings. But also, the institutions that ended up developing, emerging, persisting in the European colonies have a huge amount of variation. Just compare Canada and United States to Indonesia or Peru. All colonies, but very different trajectories. So therefore, the theory, which I'm going to start with, is one that uses the same conceptual framework that I've already outlined, but says, can we say anything about the origins of this institutional variation? And the idea here, which is sort of not so different from the conceptual framework, but uses a little bit of the historical context, is that Europeans adopted very different colonization strategies depending on whether they settled or not. When they did not settle, the main thing they were able to do was to exploit the resources on the ground, like for example in the Spice Islands or the silver in Latin America, and the people on the ground, because they were the ones who actually did the mining, did the producing and so on. But in many of the places, Europeans also wanted to settle, because this was a time when there was a lot of European population pressure and people wanted to get out of Europe for different sorts of opportunities. And some of the colonies developed as settler colonies where there was a significant fraction of European population. So when there was this significant fraction of European population, they came to have a say in what sort of institutions developed. And in fact, many of the same institutions that the colonial powers from the top, from their sitting places in London or in Amsterdam wanted to impose, didn't always stick. So the ability of the European powers to develop and to enforce extractive institutions, especially extractive economic institutions, but because of the synergies that I emphasized, also extractive political institutions, were seriously curtailed in places where there were major populations of Europeans. So therefore, historically and conceptually, there was a causal link from European settlements to better institutions. But European settlements itself is not exogenous. Perhaps Europeans went and settled in places that were more promising in terms of future growth opportunities. So there, it turns out that Europeans actually were happy to try to settle in many places, but at the end were only able to settle in a few because the health conditions, especially the mismatch between the diseases for which Europeans had immunity and the diseases on the ground, created only opportunities for Europeans to settle in a few places. In particular, European death rates at throughout this period, even in the 19th century, were very, very high. But they were high from gastrointestinal diseases, typhus, typhoid, smallpox, and things like that. But Europeans had no immunity to other types of diseases that were more semi-tropical in nature, like yellow fever and malaria. So, for a variety of reasons, therefore, Europeans faced very high mortality rates and could not settle in a large number of potential colonies. So therefore, the theory that I'm going to exploit in trying to estimate the impact of institutions, long-run institutions on long-run economic growth, is that there is this variation in the types of institutions between inclusive and extractive, of course, many of them in the gray area, but also covering this line. The colonization strategy was influenced by the feasibility of settlements. And then the third element, so I said history is not the full determinant, but history does matter. Once you had a set of institutions, they persisted. And a lot of the book in Why Nations Fail, we actually talk about persistence. So a lot of the discussion is and very interesting part of it, in my opinion, is about these persistence mechanisms, but I'm not going to talk about them today. So therefore, this is the schematic representation, potential settler mortality. Potential because in many cases, settlers did not even try. The mortality was so high that there were some troops that went there and they died and nobody tried. That influenced settlements, those influenced early institutions influence current institutions, and early and current institutions together influence current performance. So here is the source of variation that I'm talking about. So on the horizontal axis, I have the settler mortality, or well, potential settler mortality. This is in logs, and it reflects huge variation. There are places like Mali, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, where the settler mortality was so high that essentially if you went there, within a year you would be dead. So actually people tried, like, there were some famous expeditions like Mango Park and a couple of others who tried repeatedly. Actually, Mango Park went twice. And the first time he survived, and the second time he died. But then there were places like Australia and New Zealand where typhus, typhoid, and cholera were absent. So they were actually healthier than Europe, quite a bit healthier than Europe. So this is the relationship between this settler mortality in logarithms and one measure of institutions. Which measure doesn't matter, and this is not a sort of variation that's going to be able to tell us in a micro level, is it financial institutions or is it contracts or is it the judicial system? So this is a bundle of institutions. If you put it in a regression setting, this is what it looks like, and the one thing I want to emphasize is that it's a fairly strong relationship, as you can see from the graph, and also it is robust to including a wide range of things. Here I've shown you just the basic things, that this is very different from just pure geography, like distance from the semi-tropical areas, latitude. It's not driven by continents. And one thing you might worry about, that this is just about these 4 places, which have become Anglo colonies, huge settler colonies, what sometimes people call neo-Europes. So this column says it's not just driven by that. Of course, the relationship does get weaker when you exclude them, but there is still a fairly strong relationship when they are left out. And then this is what we call two-stage least squares. What it says is that let's just exploit the variation in institutions coming from this settler mortality. And what you find is that this measure of institutions, which is, as I said, is a proxy for a broader set of institutions, is very significant, and the relationship remains fairly stable and fairly robust, whatever you seem to do. So here again, I've shown you a few things, but there are lots of other things you may want to worry about: temperature, humidity, other soil conditions, whether you're a British colony, Dutch colony, etc., life expectancy, other conditions on the ground, whether this is just capturing current health and things like that, and in religion, etc. And in all of these cases, the relationship remains very robust. And quantitatively, this is large. It's not implausibly large, because remember, we're talking about economic development at the end of 200 years, so we're looking at this cumulative effect in terms of today's GDP per capita. It says that if you take, for example, Nigeria's institutions and change them to Chile's institutions, and Nigeria and Chile are 2 examples I picked because they are at the 75th and the 25th percentile of the distribution, you close about 3/4 of the gap. So it's not that institutions are everything, but they are the bulk of the differences in these long-run performance. And then the other thing I want to emphasize is that this theory is just one sliver of what's going on. I'm certainly not claiming that the colonial history determines everything. And whatever it determines it through a process in which this persistence happens in some interesting way. People don't change it, and again, I don't have time to get into the details, but you see this in Mexico, how the institutions repeat themselves, they change, but they get recreated, and so on and so forth. So that process is interesting, but also importantly, look at the R-square of this regression. So only 25% of this variation in institutions today is due to this. So there's a lot of the 75% that's not due to this aspect of colonial history, it's due to other things. Some of it might still be historical, but some of it might very well reflect, as I'm going to talk about, current changes. So this is my exhibit 1 in terms of institutions' long-run effect. Okay? But by its nature, it really exploits long distance, long time ago events, and looks at the cumulative impact. The second thing I want to emphasize is that sometimes when you talk about institutions, people think, well, institutions are really at the country level. But I want to argue very strongly about that. A lot of the interesting variation is at the country level, but even more of the interesting variation is within country. Think of south of Italy versus north of Italy. Think of different states of Brazil, different states of Mexico, or different states of the United States, or different states of India. There are huge differences in terms of how laws are enforced, what laws there are, how informal arrangements trump the laws or not, and in some cases, very much in the degree of coercion, etc. So it turns out that you get very similar results by exploiting carefully designed within-country variation. So again, sticking with the colonial period, one of the major extractive institutions, as I already hinted at, that Europeans set up were coerced labor institutions, not just in the form of slavery to get the sugar out, but in terms of other arrangements in Latin America. So Latin America, for the most part, except for Brazil and Colombia, did not have explicit slavery, but it had these whole gamut of other arrangements, like encomiendas, which were land grants with coerced labor, like repartimiento, which were different types of coerced labor used for transportation. But perhaps the most infamous one was used in mining, to get the silver out of the Potosi mines. And also mercury, but the most important part is the silver. So the Potosi mine is essentially between Peru and Bolivia today. And it was a nexus of coerced labor during colonial times. That coerced labor was the mine was closed after about 100 years of operation. So the direct coercion disappeared, but again, these institutional things, especially when you have very strict extractive institutions supported by very much repressive extractive political institutions, have the potential to persist, as I emphasize in the context of Mexico, for instance. So Melissa Dell examines the long-run effects of the META, and this is totally within-country variation, within Bolivia and within Peru, and the clever approach here is that she uses the fact that not everywhere in Peru and Bolivia there was coerced labor. Since coerced labor was mainly about getting the mine, getting the silver out of the mine, essentially what the Spaniards did is that they drew a catchment area around the mine, and they said all the villages within this catchment area are subject to coerced labor. The male are going to be shipped to the mine and they have to do this, just like slaves. But people outside the catchment area don't have to do that. So then she uses what is sometimes called a regression discontinuity design. So essentially comparing villages just outside and just inside the catchment area boundary. So these villages are very close to each other. So you would expect a lot of the effects of institutions to attenuate because, today they live under the same federal or national law. There has been perhaps a lot of interactions between these villages. Actually, there hasn't been all that much interactions. Nobody goes from one village to the other. There's no migration between villages, but there's migration from villages to the cities. So essentially, after 400 years, 400 years after the abolition of the specific coerced labor institution, she looks at whether there are still traces of it. And the answer is yes. This is a META dummy, and here she's looking at household consumption, and the same thing, you find very similar effects if you look at stunting, which is how whether people are very low height relative to their age. You see about 35 to 30% difference, poorer people in villages that were subject to the coerced labor institutions. And the reason why this seems to have persisted is exactly through the institutional channels. In places where there was coercion, very different economic institutions arose. In particular, haciendas, which are not great things themselves, they are the continuation of the encomienda, but still better than this coerced labor institutions, did not come into the catchment area. So you have essentially a lack of even the exploitative typical labor relations in agriculture that is so common in Latin America, and instead you have still a much more monopolistic and government-controlled structure within the encomienda, within the META, and that seems to have persisted and has had a durable effect on a variety of things, including these infant health outcomes and household consumption. But again, this is just like the evidence I presented from the colonial experience is about long-term changes. Now, the only evidence I've presented so far about sort of short-term changes is North Korea, but that's also, 50 years and also, as I mentioned, it's quite extreme. So what I want to turn now to is whether institutional changes can have impacts even at short-run frequencies. And to do this, you have to find the dimension of institutions that actually changes at short run. We can identify it, and we expect it to have an influence on economic outcomes or health outcomes, which I'm going to show you also. And one candidate is democracy. So when I describe politically inclusive institutions, you may have thought, oh, this sounds a little bit like democracy, broad distribution of political power. Well, the way that I describe it is that it's democracy plus, meaning that democracy, meaning people actually having a say in who is elected, who governs them, etc., is a minimum that you need to have for politically inclusive institutions, but it's not sufficient. So when Venezuelans elected Hugo Chavez, that was not a democracy, because what they did is that, what Chavez did is that he actually tore down all of the control mechanisms. He got elected, but then he ran as a dictator. So that sort of means that we need more than democracy, but we're not able to measure that. So I'm going to take democracy as a pretty coarse measure, proxy, or just one dimension of politically inclusive institutions. So with everything I've said, you can have three different views on democracy. One is you can say, well, it's not fully politically inclusive institutions, so I don't know what we'll do. The second, you can say, well, it's still one dimension of politically inclusive institutions. If you are right, politically inclusive institutions should impact economic institutions, and through that channel should affect economic prosperity and a range of economic relationships. Or the third, you can say, well, your theory is already totally wrong and I don't believe it, and therefore democracy should be irrelevant, or perhaps it's a bad thing. We like to complain about democracy, about the gridlocks, look at what, that was so crazy. The Brits had the referendum and decided to go out. If that was instead in the hands of the Queen or the Prime Minister, perhaps it would have been better outcomes. So if you look at the pages of newspapers and so on, you'll find more often than not people complaining about democracy. And curiously enough, I've been for a long time put off from investigating democracy for the simple reason that I sort of believed what I was reading in the academic literature, which had concluded that democracy is not good for economic growth. It might be irrelevant or perhaps a small negative effect. So therefore, what I'm going to talk about is more recent work, not from the 2000 as like the previous stuff that I was talking about, but a paper from 2 years ago that's still sort of part of active work. But at some point I said, well, let's sort of look at that more systematically, and I did that with Suresh Naidu, Pasquale Restrepo, and James Robinson. And what we found is that actually, contrary to what you will read in newspapers and sort of consensus, although not a complete consensus in the academic literature, the conclusion is very clear, and there is a very rapid but over time upbuilding effect of democracy on economic growth. So here it is. I'll give you the bottom line, and I'll show you a few details in a second. What I'm doing here is I'm going to take a binary dichotomous measure of democracy. So either you have democracy or not. Now, in practice, there are many measures that are degradations of democracy. But it turns out that when you're trying to decide whether France is more democratic than Spain, that's a lot of measurement error. And there is a lot of movement there, but it's not very informative. So we have sort of coded back to a dichotomous measure. So this is then an event study graph. And what it shows you is that countries that democratize, 0 is the year that a country democratizes, relative to countries that were also non-democracies but did not democratize. So for every country, I'm comparing them to non-democracies that remain non-democracies in that year. And then I'm following them over time. Okay? So what you see here is two things that are pretty interesting. One of them is, if you just look at this part of the picture, you see that actually the countries that democratize relative to their growth experience in the past or relative to other democracies, non-democracies, grow faster. Actually, this is very similar to what I'm going to find with much more econometric work also, about 20% richer in about 20 years. Not, this is not, we're not talking of turning Nigeria into Chile. That would have required tripling income per capita, but this is within 20 years, not that bad. When I was making the Nigeria-Chile comparison, that's within 200 years. There it's like the long run effect. So 20% within 20 years is not too bad. But the second thing, and this is where the econometric problems come, and I think some of the issues in past work, countries don't democratize randomly. Democratization itself is an endogenous thing. And in particular, it happens, what this shows is that it happens when countries are in the midst of an economic crisis. So there is a very long tradition in political science, which turns out upon closer inspection not to be true at all, that countries democratize when they get richer. So it's called the Modernization Hypothesis. There is very little evidence in support of that. But what it seems to be true is that countries democratize when their non-democratic regime has a big crisis. And that's what you're seeing here. So therefore, any attempt to sort of estimate the effect of democracy has to do a couple of things. It has to, first of all, compare like to like. The reason why in some newspapers you hear democracy is terrible is that they're comparing, France to China. Well, we can't compare France to China. They're totally in different stages of development. They have different counterfactual growth paths. So you have to do that, and we typically do that by including fixed effects. Second, and that's very central, you have to control for these dynamics. So any model that doesn't control for dynamics, it doesn't allow for GDP to have rich dynamics, is not going to work. And third, you don't want to throw this into, average this into a 5-year growth interval or anything like that. You really need to work with as high frequency data as possible. Okay, so here is the simplest way of doing this. This is not my favorite way of doing it, but it's the simplest way of doing it, and it shows the result, and then I'll show you my favorite ways of doing it. So here it is. This is a very simple model which has democracy on the right-hand side, GDP per capita on the left-hand side, lags of GDP per capita, 4 years of lags is sufficient, and country fixed effects and time fixed effects. So it's allowing for the world to shift around, each country to have their own long-run equilibrium level, and also slow dynamics to that. And what you see is that, in fact, a country that democratizes increases GDP per capita by about 0.7%. But that's just the first year effect, and that effect builds up over time exactly like what this graph shows. And in about 25 years, you have a 17% increase in GDP per capita. Now, this is here without any covariance, without controlling for anything. And then here you control for lots of things. You don't want to control for things that are endogenous on the right-hand side, same reasons that we talked about. But you can control for differential trends of all sorts and other things. And the answer is this doesn't change anything. The long-run effect hovers around 16 to 20%. Here is another thing we can do. If you look at this dynamics, it looks quite rich. And there's this down here, there is this slow increase here, few years, not much, and then from 10 years on. So you want to do this perhaps with a much more flexible model. So one way to do this is by essentially semi-parametric matching methods, which has two advantages. You're sort of not imposing much on the data. But second, you can also see whether this way of controlling for GDP dynamics and who democratizes, selection into democracy, actually corrects for this dip here. So whether this dip here is taken out. Because if this dip is still remaining, that will still make you worry, rightly, that you're comparing apples and oranges. Okay? So here it is. So when you do that, this dip is totally disappeared. And you see that, in fact, there is not much for the first 5 years or so. And then it builds up to, again, about 20%. All of these are OLS methods, so they're not using exogenous source of variation. And then a final thing you can do is to say, well, is there any exogenous source of variation? That's not going to be perfect because we're now looking at really short-term things, but is there anything that we can exploit? And one thing it turns out that was already emphasized in the political science literature is waves of democratization and waves of collapses of democratization, regional waves in particular. So if you do that, you see that there are huge waves in democracy, and you can exploit that. And if you do that, let me just get to the bottom line, you find exactly the same results, slightly larger effects, perhaps 20%, in some specifications 25%. And then the final thing I want to show you before I conclude is why is it that democracies are doing better? And it is not that democracies suddenly are become more efficient. That would make you suspicious. And it's not, it is a little bit more investment in democracies, but it's not super robust. But the reason why democracies do better, which very much coheres with the theoretical structures, the theoretical conceptual framework that I emphasize, is two things. One, democracies are actually, again, contrary to what you might sort of read from some sort of arguments about gridlock, etc., democracies are much better at reforming monopolies and restrictive practices. So this is an index of economic reform from the IMF, and of course there are problems with every index of economic reform. They're putting different things in there, and there's some subjectivity, but there's a huge positive effects. Democracies pass, especially very soon after they come to power, they pass a range of economic reforms, which IMF finds as beneficial. And second, democracies don't trade more, but they tax more, and they use that tax for a couple of things. For education, especially primary education, somewhat secondary, but especially primary education and child health. So in other words, they're investing more in public services, and this is sort of having a reflection in economic performance. But then going back to the early slide that I started with, if we care not just about prosperity, which we care a lot about, but not just about that. We care about infant health. We care about health of the population at large, control of violence. In all of these things, actually, democracies seem to be better. So that doesn't mean democracies don't have any faults, and I'm sure in the discussion period we'll talk more about that, especially we are in Europe, how could we not talk about the problems of democracy? But I think it's also good to sort of step back and say, compared to the alternative, which is all non-democratic regimes, democracies are actually doing great. So in sum, what I have done is I have provided a conceptual framework in a very summary pill form, and then I have provided long-run evidence exploiting cross-country variation, long-run evidence exploiting within variation, and short-run evidence exploiting institutional transitions, and all of them point to the sort of the big picture that these institutional dimensions are very important, but they're not exogenous. In all cases, we really have to worry about this endogeneity, why societies are choosing that, what other things are different about the societies that choose that. That's from an econometric point of view. But from a substantive point of view, then what are the things that we can do so that these choices don't go in the wrong direction? I'll stop there, and then we'll continue in the debate period. Thank you.